it's not like Origen didn't think of freedom as like
a novel idea.
Yeah. It's like, but more interestingly, he not only thought of it, but he preempted the kind of defense of hell, as it were, by appeal to free will, by realizing that, in a sense, it would relapse into exactly the thing you just said, which is an absolute dualism. I had never really gotten to the part in an academic post where you start to actually reap what you sow, where it's like, oh yeah, you get a whole summer, like a very flexible schedule. You can go in some days I don't go in. And then, then you start repeating courses so you don't have to do as much preparation, like the longer you kind of stay in it, the more it sort of works in your favor. And I had only just like started like 2 or 3 times and then moved on. So I kind of got all the negatives to the positives, but yeah, so I'm doing good, man. How are you?
Been great. Yeah. Doing mostly, web stuff. So I've been a little distracted from my other run-of-the-mill duties. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I've been good.
Good.
What's been your your most recent read?
Ooh, that's a good question. The very, very most recent that I finished. Well, there's 2 that immediately come to mind. I'm one of those that reads too many books like at the same time, and yet I have a system where it's like I have a morning read, I've got a night read, I've got a read when it's like this whole ridiculous thing. So I finished Valentin Tomberg's book called Thy Kingdom Come, The New Evolution of the Good. It's a very short book on like one of the last things Tomberg wrote, the Meditations on the Tarot.
Okay.
And so somebody sent me this small book. It's really only like 60, 70 pages. Kind of just like his take on what the shift to an evolutionary framework of the world kind of like its positives and negatives and like the challenges it poses for spiritual and philosophical and psychological and theological thinking.
Evolutionary framework as in like Darwinian?
Yeah, mostly Darwinian. Yeah, like the sort of, basically I would guess, the tendency towards sort of flattening everything into a horizontal plane rather than kind of the older version, as you well know. It's whatever version you're looking at least there's kind of more of like a more or less direct vertical column relation between the higher and the lower. So even if you've got the sort of relative like producing according to their kind that happens on the horizontal level, there's still like boundaries that kind of tie it to the vertical realm of eternal truth and ideals. And I like that the diagnosis was nice because it's just sometimes I think people kind of underplay the radicality of the shift. And it's like, well, no, like what does it really mean to really think through the lens or think through the kind of framework of like everything has a universal common ancestor that has had to proliferate over eons and change. And, so he's got this kind of 3 kingdoms framework that he does: the kingdom of nature, the kingdom of human beings, and the kingdom of God. And so he's sort of like he's trying to say history as we perceive it is kind of actually the intermingling of all 3 at once. And so anyway, it's an interesting, I don't know if you've ever read anything by him. I actually thought you'd probably, okay. I wouldn't have been surprised if you had said yes. Cause yeah, his Meditations on the Tarot, I haven't read all of, it's pretty huge. But very interesting. He's basically a Christian hermeticist, Russian immigrant, expatriate from the Soviet Union, died in like 1973 or so. But yeah, published Meditations on the Tarot anonymously. And then, but it's sort of like he knows the Hermetic side really well. He had all these different, as those like mid-century Russian immigrant, like they have all these different roles they played and stuff. So anyway, that was probably the most recent one. The second one before that, I'll just mention, is Gillian Rose, who's one of my favorite modern philosophers, like modern, like in terms of the last, say 50 years. She's a Jewish philosopher and a Hegelian. So she died relatively early of a certain sort of cancer. Like she was only like 46 or 47, but
Oh, wow.
she's got a great book. One of the last books she wrote called Mourning, in the sense of crying, lamenting.
Yeah.
Mourning Becomes the Law, Philosophy and Representation. That was also kind of a short book, though. It was only like 130 or 40 pages, but she's totally fascinating to me. So those are the last two books that I've read. What about you?
Got somebody breaking in here.
I can relate to that.
I've been mostly reading through different near-death experience books. The two most recent ones are, I'm going through Dr. Bruce Grayson's book After, which is probably going to be my new go-to recommendation as like an introduction to the subject, because he does a great job. Like he hits a lot of different elements to the subject, and he's a authority in the field. So that's a really good one. And then another one is a book called To Die Is Gain by Johann Christoph Hampe. And he was one of the original, like, first publishers on this subject. Back in, I think I believe he wrote his book in German, and he published it in about, I think, 1974, which was a year before Raymond Moody published his 1975 book, which is what popularized the subject. He's the one that coined the term near-death experience. And but this other guy was doing the same thing, kind of completely isolated from what Moody was doing in this United States. And it's fascinating, like seeing like the different data points that are brought out, the different anecdotes, and the responses to the new data. And so that's what I've been reading recently.
You've been reading on NDE stuff for a while, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like one of the things you've been doing most recently.
Yeah. Kind of dive in as deep as I can to these subjects.
It's a pretty good way to spend your time.
Yeah. But for today, we're here to discuss traditional afterlife beliefs in Christianity. Now, you would have a more humble and inaccurate way of introducing yourself. So I'll rescue the facts from the afterlife, as if you want your rewards in heaven. So you're a assistant professor of theology at Belmont University, and that's in Nashville, right?
Yeah. Yep.
You're a Roman Catholic scholar, philosopher, theologian, and you're an authority on Maximus the Confessor, but you're also knowledgeable on the Church Fathers and the Bible more widely. And I go to you for any questions about Hegel. You're good on Hegel and George MacDonald, right? So I think that's accurate, right?
That's accurate. Yeah, it's good. It's I think in this way we're probably similar, where I just go where the questions I have get the best play. You know, like I'm not like an antiquarian in the sense of like, oh, this is my period or my century or my whatever. It's like,
yeah,
I just kind of go where I need to go, you know? So.
Yeah, that's like I kind of feel bad for the people who are stuck studying this one thing for decades. Like I just have too much curiosity for that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, and I think honestly that'll become more and more. It's already becoming more and more the case, both in and outside of the higher ed realm. Because on the one hand, there's so many it's just we can do these kinds of things, right? And there's the YouTube. You can go straight to certain people that are like better on certain things. And then on the other hand, even within, and it's something I've sort of realized, but I'm trying to in a sense, take advantage of. Even within the higher ed, you have to be a generalist more and more anyway, because they're squeezing the jobs anyway, and they're asking you to do more for less anyway. So, even if you're like in a tenure track position, like I found myself in somehow, it's not hard to get tenured in terms of like on the publishing thing. So the bright side of all that is just to say, you don't have to be pigeonholed. Like you don't have to produce 3 to 5 books on the same thing in order to be promoted someday or whatever, in order to retain whatever kind of prestige remains of the crumbling system. So, both people that are autodidacts and then those that are even supposedly not, then it's like that's going to become more. Yeah, that's there's downsides to that. I mean, there's definitely you can get people out there that are so wide that they seem incapable of nuance in anything in particular. But nevertheless, I mean, here we are.
Classic mile wide, inch deep.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, we all feel that, I'm sure. Yeah. We all have that feel. But also at the same time, like you're saying, the other side of it is like I've known certain, advisors or directors I've had in the past that are like, oh, like I never read anything outside of like this little sliver because I don't have time, number one. And in the time I do have, it has to be in order to turn that over into some publication or whatever, which I can only really manage in this one little thing. So that never seemed appealing either. So
yeah, it's hard. It's a hard middle ground. I've come to realize that it's like, because you can't study any one subject without discovering some relevance to some other subject. And like, if you get too deep into one without educating yourself on others, then you just end up with like a multitude of wrong presuppositions about the one that you're reading. Right? So it's like you need to have an understanding of multiple to even understand. You need to understand the whole to understand the parts.
Exactly.
And so, but that, of course, takes a lot of time and effort.
And speaking of Hegel, then, I mean, that's what's so great about the preface to the Phenomenology. It's a preface, but the entire preface is more or less just like a lament about having to write a preface. because his point is what you just said, which is there's nothing really to say until you see the whole, but you're not going to see the whole until you get going with the parts. So here I am.
So here you go. Go waste your time reading a preface.
What's great
that understand.
What's great though is then that preface stretches on for like 50 pages. Okay, well. Okay,
yeah,
so you had
come back to it.
You had something to say, yeah. I honestly, that probably is what he was thinking. Was I'm going to come, you should come back to it, which is actually not a bad way to do it. So.
Right, yeah. Now you're most known, I would say, online for being vocally in favor of universalism.
Yes,
and I would point out that you had a really great debate in February of last year. Was it sponsored by the Institute for Human Ecology? Was that
exactly. Yeah,
Catholic University of America?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And but you didn't. So people watching this should check that out. But you didn't wake up one day just saying, "Hey, I'm gonna believe that God saves everybody."
No,
as a process of it, a long journey. So Can you describe your Christian background for viewers and the afterlife beliefs you were raised in?
Yeah, absolutely. I was raised in the Stone-Campbell or Restoration movement, which is a Second Great Awakening American, American born and raised sort of religion, or I should say, form of Christian religion. But that particular tradition, I mean, it's not controversial to say that. I had to take a whole class on it. So I went to a Bible college eventually in that tradition. I was going to become a minister of some sort in that tradition. As I'm the youngest of three. I got two brothers, the youngest three boys. My two older brothers are ministers ordained in that tradition still to this day. One's a New Testament professor at that Bible college, which is my alma mater, and then the other one is an associate pastor at a pretty big church. And then my dad's a hospice chaplain. He late in life, he had several careers, but late in life he went back to school in his 50s and became a minister and is now a hospice chaplain. Anyway, so my whole family's still in that tradition. So there's things I appreciate about it, but more or less that tradition is a decentralized, congregationalist, low church, biblicist tradition. It's one of those traditions that's birthed in a kind of charismatic revival context, but then has to kind of like persist institutionally, but is always anti-institutional. So you don't even have like a Baptist convention. You don't even have like a convention. It's nothing. There's no de facto, though. Of course, what you end up having is like, especially I'd say in the last century, it was like the Bible colleges are sort of de facto like the centers. And then, of course, in the last, say, 30, 40 years, you get the mega church pastor, who's sort of, and there are actually several mega churches in that tradition, oddly enough. But it's one of those churches, too, that if you saw it, you wouldn't even know it belonged to a tradition. It's just called, whatever city Christian church or whatever. So I was raised in that context. I say all that only because it's tough to, just by the nature of that, the diffusive, fragmentary nature of that whole thing, it really was like dependent on whatever church you happen to be at in terms of what you're going to get. So that's the other interesting thing. And I've come now to realize that I think that's actually more important than I thought looking back. It meant that there was really no bulwarks against whatever the fad was. Like so you're going to go to churches in that tradition that are like really oddly dispensationalist. But historically, that tradition's not at all. It's actually opposed to that. Or you'll get weird contradictions. Like nowadays, you can, of course, as in many churches in America, you walk into the church and super nationalist. At the same time, it's interesting to realize that during the American Civil War, this tradition proportionately, like in terms of percentages, had the most amount of conscientious objectors because actually one of the major early founders was a pacifist. And so in the end, he was in the
Ironic.
South. Yeah. And so in the South, like the churches of Christ, the Christian churches were actually like among the most outspoken against even participating in that war, even if they're in the South. And so they and so some of them got in trouble for that, all that. So it's the point is like it's like every tradition in a lot of ways is a bundle of contradictions. Don't get me wrong. But this one's like particularly apt to just sort of everything wafted in the church, And so I think that created for someone like me, and I would imagine you can resonate with this. That's a kind of pressure cooker environment where I'm having to think through and from the ground up things all the time. Because so-and-so minister just said that. Well, here I have a Sunday school said that. Now I'm going to Bible college and now I'm getting all kinds of different stuff. And then I'm over here on the side reading books that like they don't even mention or don't allow. Or anyway, that was me reading Origen in Bible college. So
scandalous.
It's so scandalous. Yeah. It really was. That was funny. Just a quick side. It's like I had this class called Issues in Biblical Interpretation, and there was one day like devoted to Origen, and it was like out of just this anthology of and so they weren't even giving you like full text or anything.
They gave you the Wikipedia rundown, huh?
Well, you'll appreciate this. What they gave you, yes, they gave you that. And then the only like block quote was just Origen's like one spot where he's exegeting like the wood of Noah's Ark.
That's random.
Yeah, well, and so the whole class, of course, is essentially lambasting that, making fun of it.
Yeah.
So I was the weird one in the seats going, that's really interesting. That happens very often where like the people that are at most antagonistic towards like same thing with Hegel, same thing with Bulgakov, all that. It's always
isn't
like
this terrible?
Yes,
that
exactly.
sounds good actually.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, it's good, right? So it's like so anyway, but so the afterlife beliefs though in that tradition, let's see. I mean, in some ways, I don't think they were that, abnormal. Like it was very much like I guess what we could call like millenarian. Like basically, if you got a picture of heaven, it was going to be like just sort of an upgrade of what you got here. Very much infernalist for sure. Not no purgatory or anything, but just heaven or hell. Your soul goes to one place or another right upon the individual death. There is a kind of thick veil where there's no communication with the dead. There's no crossing that. There's no thin places, near-death experiences. Now, here's the weird thing, though. There's one exception to all that. I think all that's pretty standard, right? I don't think that will shock anyone.
Yeah.
The one exception to that, and again, here's another instance of the wafting in. I remember distinctly when I was like in middle school, there was about a 2 or 3 year period where our church was like really into spiritual warfare. Like bringing in authors. What was that guy's name? What's his name? Something dark. Out of darkness. Anyway, he came in and like, okay, it wasn't just like a regular speaker telling you his thing, but he would like participate in exorcisms, but then he would like record them. So this dude's coming in with like audio clips. This is way back in the day, right? In the 90s, early 90s. Audio clips, some video. And like I remember distinctly because the kids were like not allowed to be in there in the sanctuary, and this guy's like presenting all this stuff. Then it becomes like a warning about rock and roll or something. But so there is like this sense that like the partition wasn't so much between the spiritual and the physical, or the living on Earth, the terrestrial, and the otherworldly, because there was this sort of like Frank Peretti, like very interactive sense. Which is always funny, right? Because like as a Catholic now, it's like those same people will be like, "Wow, do you pray to saints?" I'm like, "You think there's like a demon whispering in your ear every second?" Like,
yeah,
so like why is this odd to you? So, but that was like the way like it was sort of carved. It's almost like the dead human being and the living human being. That's an absolute divide, but not with these other sort of intermediary beings. That's a total like fluid, continuum.
Yeah, that's an odd double standard, isn't it?
It is. And they were very like kind of fixated on that. Like there was again sort of like a fad, and it became like a big thing for a while. So anyway, so there were those moments or those aspects where there's some like odder things. But I think in general, my particular church was not very obsessed with like end times. They just did the, no one knows the hour, or like whatever, who knows. And I would honestly say in general then, unless you got the millenarian sort of like super physicalist views of heaven, I still think by and large it was more or less an agnosticism around the character or nature of heaven. It's just like, it's more a moralistic thing, right? It's just like, look, you'll be rewarded or you won't. You'll be punished or you'll be rewarded. So that's kind of where I grew up. I can't remember if there was another part of the question, but
no, that's good. But that's a good segue into kind of going over the different interpretations of the afterlife. There's kind of a big three, but yeah, you can describe what are the historical interpretations of the afterlife from the earliest times.
Yeah, the big three. Yeah. So I think like we basically have got infernalism, and you've got annihilationism, and then you've got universalism. Of course, these are types, and there's different versions of all of them. Infernalism is probably the most familiar to people. It's infernal, inferno. I just need to make a note here because some people don't get this. Like, they think like David Bentley Hart created the term infernalism in like 2017. This is a term.
Yep.
First of all, obviously, it's just it's alluding to the Latin term for hell or the netherworld, but also like Hans von Balthasar, the Swiss Catholic theologian, was already using this term in like the 70s and 80s. So it's funny, like when Balthasarians freak out about that because like their guy made it up. But okay, so infernalism, right, is just that the whatever hell is, however you characterize it, it's the place where the damned go, those who've resisted or rejected God, or whom God has rejected or resisted, or maybe both. They're punished forever. There's some sort of element of torment that never ends, like in a line. And they're separated, therefore, from God and from the bliss of heaven. Although, in some versions, those in heaven can sort of peer upon the damned in their anguish, and somehow that adds to their own pleasure.
And that was popularized by Aquinas, right?
I mean, that particular idea goes all the way back to Tertullian.
Is he the one who popularized that?
Oh no, yeah. You said popularized, yeah. So I guess I would say, yeah, the popularizer really was Lombard, Peter Lombard, in the early Middle Ages, and it's through Lombard and the Lombard sentences that someone like Aquinas, picks it up. But so does like Saint Bonaventure. So it became kind of a widespread thing. That's probably some version of that, maybe minus some of the Catholic stuff. Most people are probably familiar with heaven, hell, the two ways theology. This is kind of darkness and light. You're in the outer darkness, you're in the inner light, whatever. So that the absolute, I would call that an absolute eschatological dualism, which in the end, that's what infernalism really is. It's an actual persistent dualism. Annihilationism, on the other hand, it's a kind of dualism, except there's no unending dualism, because one side of the duality, namely those that are damned or judged, will simply be annihilated. They will go out of existence, and there's different ways to run that. Does God put them out of existence, like you put out the wick, the wick of a burning candle, you squeeze it? Or is it like something like metaphysical suicide, where someone sort of puts themselves out of existence, or maybe it's a cooperation with God, like might say an eschatological euthanasia.
Yeah.
So annihilationism, that again, some version has been there of all these since really the 2nd century.
And what sources would you point at?
So for the annihilation is a little more, it's a lot less attested. However, there are certain lines in the Didache. There are certain lines in First Clement. Like the Didache almost seems to explicitly say, and these also have prehistories in like Jewish Second Temple Judaism and so forth. So I'm not saying they made them up, but representative in the early Christian tradition. And then probably, I think it's like, what is it, Arnobius? I think it's Arnobius in the 2nd century. Either him or Tatian, but I think it's Arnobius who's like more explicitly annihilationist. For the Infernalists, you get all the way early on, you will have Justin Martyr, but oddly, I think he's picking that up from certain strands, not only from Second Temple Judaism, but really from Plato, who also has certain moments and certain texts that are pretty infernalist, you could say, even with lakes of fire and everything. But then I think the biggest popularizer in the form in which infernalism took, especially in the West, of course, you just have to point to eventually St. Augustine. So that's sort of that strand. So we've got infernalism, the two ways, the persistence of the two ways in the end. You've got annihilationism. Let's put it as the eschatological euthanasia, so that one side of the duality falls out. And then you've got universalism. Universalism, early representatives, I call him Saint Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, and then of course the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
But and Jesus, no.
Yeah.
That's what Infernalists be like. What?
Yeah.
So
It's funny. It's funny because like you make that argument tongue in cheek, but your opponents will make the same argument unironically.
exactly right. Which I tell even my students here, because we do a little eschatology unit in my intro Christian theology class, and of course a lot of my students come from I don't know, Baptist, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, like they're almost all Protestant of some kind, and so they're pretty like blown away by all these options, even at all, and getting into the details. It really is like it was like they were really taken like the last month of the semester, like wanting to talk to me outside of class and all kinds of stuff.
I had no idea that just believing the Bible could be so complicated.
That's the thing. And the number one thing I tell them, I'm like, look, honestly, I will be honest with you. I don't have to make every verse literally support my view. I don't think that's how theology works. I don't think it ever has, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff, you and I would probably most likely agree on there.
Yeah.
But I said, look, if I really tried to force myself to be a real consistent literalist, I don't think that's possible ultimately. But if I could, I think Annihilation probably wins. Just the amount of like the images, all destructive. Like people will cite Jude for infernalism. Like, why would you cite Jude for infernalism? He calls it the eternal fire, but then he likens it to Sodom and Gomorrah. How long did that last?
Mm-hmm.
Like a few hours in the old. So you could go over and over and over again. And it's like destruction, all that language, and then the fact that like the Didache, First Clement. I mean, they do seem to kind of say. I mean, the Didache straight out says, there's two destinations. These people will go to heaven. These people will be destroyed.
And as Origen pointed out, the word eternal does not mean what the Infernalist thinks it means. It's referring to the duration of an age.
Exactly. I mean, the best way, obviously, it's an elastic term. It's always got to be contextualized. Yeah. You'll find different kinds of eternity in, like, Plotinus, for example.
Yeah.
But I say, like, if you want to sort of give a generic category or definition, really the best way to think of it is simply a negation of this age. It's another age or another dimension, or sort of how we want to say, another age, aeon, that is determined for you right now by its not being like the one you're in.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the best I can do, and then there's contextual things to like details, but yeah. So I mean, and you can see that already in the New Testament, as you well know. I mean, if you really track the language, it's like not only do you get funny things like eternal fire but you get like eternal time is mentioned, and then it's in the plural, eternal times. What does that mean? That's in like 1 Timothy. So anyway, but those are the three. I've never really said universalism. Just simply put, is that every single thing that God created will eventually be saved, restored, unified, deified, so that there is nothing that God has made that is not therefore destined through their own love and desire, sure, according to the kind of thing they are, but nevertheless will be saved. Nothing. So here it's interesting. There is no absolute duality. There's no persistence of the duality, and one side, as it were, wins out and becomes the whole, but it's the opposite of the annihilationist side. Here, the side that is true, good, beautiful, divine, that is what everything becomes. And so there, in that sense, too, there's no absolute persistent duality. The only really persistent, total, absolute duality is infernalism.
When you were talking, I thought it was interesting when you compared Justin Martyr and Plato, and it reminded me of this interesting phenomenon that happens when you really dig into the texts. How you have inherited metaphysical frameworks, and then people kind of cherry pick things from those frameworks, and then their framework becomes something different because of what they left.
Yes,
exactly. And because with Plato, his, when he talks about, infernalist concepts, that's couched in the framework of like transmigration.
Right.
And like the idea that there is this constant flowing of this like duality of the living coming from the dead and the dead coming from the living, and it's this flow of you can call it development of the soul. And so it's set in that framework. And then you have someone like Justin Martyr come. He'll take the infernalist concepts and then leave the reincarnation stuff. And then that becomes something completely different.
Absolutely. And again, this is one of those moments where it's like, if you say you were talking to an infernalist and they're like, they have a problem with that, you could simply point to, for example, First Peter, and you can say, look, the same thing is happening there on your account, because he clearly uses the image and the terminology of Stoic conflagration, which, of course, in that system, as best we can tell, and there's, of course, there's different versions, but seemingly pretty consistent across even the different eras or movements of Stoicism, meant an endless cycle of cosmic time. The conflagration was that point at which all the elements of the world from which everything is constituted are melted down in this absolute molten core of the universe, almost like back down the great crunch, what we would now call in physics, the crunch, and then it, expands back out. It's going to unroll. Now, when Peter says that in First Peter, do you think that means he's a Stoic? No, of course not. You read it through the infernalist eschatology that you assume he has, which is a different discussion. But you assume he has that, and you would say, oh, well, yeah, he's using the term and the image and everything, but that's actually like hell the way I understand it, right? And it's like, okay, so anyway, it's just, I find myself often pointing that out to my students whom I understand. I mean, I don't blame them at all. I mean, this is part of the whole point. But even with people that kind of ought to know better, where it's like, look, stop pretending you're like the one just reading off the page. And like, you're just the one that's just seeing reality and you got no system at work. And it's just like, come on.
I've inherited nothing. The Holy Spirit tells me all things.
Oh, really? It sounds like, well, it kind of makes it sound like you're the source of all things.
I don't need teachers.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the modern example of what I was talking about is how in the contemporary Orthodox world, it's become popular to talk about the fires of hell as the love of God.
Yes.
And I wonder where that comes from.
Exactly.
Not right out of the Universalists.
Straight out of all right. Yeah.
Origins. Right out of St. Isaac the Syrian.
Exactly. You even get that? Who was I reading not long ago? Yeah, you find that, of course, but it was also a Universalist. But I mean, I've had angry Dominicans coming at me on the Catholic side, saying I'm a heretic and stuff, and it's like, well, what do you think hell is for? Like, what does it do, or what is it? Well, you would expect them to give, like, I don't know, the description Saint Augustine gives, or the description that St. Thomas Aquinas gives, or say the description of the Council of Trent, like one of our favorites. Nope, they give Isaac of Nineveh. It's like, oh, okay. Okay, great.
Unironically promoting the people that you claim are heretics.
Yes,
like the
exactly.
Positions you claim are heresy. So let's talk about because the way I see it is like this pivotal moment happened around I would say between the 3rd to 5th centuries, where you have really doctrine begins to develop in very different ways, and depending on the region. And you have this huge scholarly hub in Alexandria that's developing really around Origen's thought. And I would, by extension, bring that also out to Caesarea, because he ends up moving there, and there's a whole Origen Caesarea hub. So then you have, and that's like, the Cappadocians are following that, Athanasius is following that, Chrysostom is influenced by it, Ambrose of Milan. So like you have this thought stemming from Origen in the East, and then you have the more Roman view, which is really amplifying Augustine's voice. So let's start with Origen and talk about Origen's view of the afterlife and why it was a turning point for afterlife beliefs in Christianity ever since.
Yeah. Yeah, so the way I understand, of course, as is usual, there's disagreement about certain things and details, but the way I understand it is this. I'm just going to throw this out there, and actually, I kind of want your reaction to this too, because you studied Origen in detail, so we'll see kind of how this plays with you. Like, I want to say, like, let me just say what I'm not saying first. I might actually clarify. Usually, people. And this was common, say, like in the work of Henri Crouzel and other people, who I think was pretty good work, especially given the time and stuff, where you can treat Origen kind of like a sort of proto-scholastic, and so you can kind of carve up his thought into topoi or topics, and you get to his eschatology. And look, I think there's some merit in that. I mean, obviously on first principles, there's a sort of logic that he himself lays out that you could sort of then see distinct moments in his thinking or whatever. But I actually, why I'm saying like the liability of that kind of framework is that it can sound like Origen sort of is just trying out ideas almost at random. Like, I'm going to turn to this problem now, or this field or topic or area, and I'm going to try out some stuff. We've got this idea here, this idea. I'm going to lean on universalism when it comes to the end or whatever. And I don't actually think that's really how he approached the topic. And so there's something that I would want to, and maybe someday I'll argue for, I don't know. I think there's something that I would want to call like an Origenian frame of thinking or way of thinking. And I think it's actually more Christ-centered initially than people realize. And I think it basically goes like this. In fact, I even think that the intra-Origenian fights, like between the Isochristoi and the Protoctists, of which we know very little, but the little we do know, I actually think this framework I'm about to describe would even incorporate both of them, and it actually explains their disagreement, but that's a different topic for another day. But here's the framework. If Christ is the beginning and end, but he showed up in the middle, then whatever is true of Christ is true about the beginning and end. Whatever is true of Christ, both in his history, his origin, his history, and his destiny, is also true of all things beginning and end, or what I often refer to as the edges of creation. So I think that's like a fundamental intuition. It explains a lot of, not everything, but explains a lot of things in his thought, like, the sort of fraught passages where he sounds quote unquote subordinationist and his like subordinating the Son to the Father. Does he really do that in the commentary on John, all that stuff? Well, there's a way in which, first of all, yeah, he's in this, 3rd century or whatever, there's prior to Nicaea and all that. But also like there's a kind of sense in which he is trying to always think Christ with Adam. And then also Adam with Christ because, or you might say Christ, the Word in the world, and the world and the Word, because of the thing I just said earlier about that intuition, like what's true of Christ has got to be true of the edges and of the whole. I'm talking about earlier the whole. So I think really that's the way to frame his apokatastasis or universalism, which is that he thinks that, insofar as Christ has endured every level, kind, quality, moment of every that's possible as a creature in God's world, that he has therefore become the beginning and the end of every single level in himself, in a kind of like Ephesians 1:10 way, recapitulation of all things in heaven and on earth and under the earth in him. And so I think that's Origen's intuition, and many other people take it up later in their own ways. And I think that's the kind of like, so in other words, his systematicity, his attempt to grasp the whole through Christ, which you can see especially on first principles, but in other cases too, actually leads to that universalist inclination and affirmation, which is to say, like, look, if he doesn't actually accomplish becoming, that weird line in Colossians 1, that he might come to have first place in all things. That's the way we normally translate it. That he might become preeminent in all things, however you say it. Well, if he doesn't, that's not just like a cosmic thing, although it's that too. That goes all the way down to like, well, if I'm never saved, he's not first in me. You know, if I'm perpetually a sinner, resistant to God, hating God, even in the kind of C.S. Lewis version where I'm just sort of locked in on myself, then he's not preeminent in me. But then am I not part of God's creation? And if there's not only just one or two, but a multitude of God's creation, in whom Christ is not first and last, then that would mean the multitude, or a majority even, perhaps, of God's creation simply fails. But at that point, Christ is no longer the beginning and end of creation. So that actually renders go back to the literal thing, that renders the plain literal reading of lots of New Testament texts about Christ and his first and lastness in creation utterly absurd, just false, basically. So I'm only pointing this out. I'm only saying it this way because, like, I think it is important to see that he's not just taking up a view about the end. He's saying and seeing that there's integral relations between all these things, such that if you pull this thread and you say you become an infernalist, as most Christians have been, then I think he sees immediately already Origen in the 230s. He's already seeing that a lot of other things start to unravel then, and it becomes totally incoherent. I just think that kind of form of thinking, that systematicity, which then, yes, leads to and supports and is entailed by, as well, Universalist view of the end, is, I just think it's scarcely paralleled in the West. And Origen's there so early, and it's so potent, that form of thinking, that even those that end up turning against him still seem to reproduce that way of thinking in some way, even if it's deformed. And so that's how I would describe, in a nutshell, what happened there in the 3rd century around Origen. But I don't know. I'm honestly interested to hear what you would add, or if you would. What do you think of that kind of thing?
No, I think that's good. The thing that impressed me the most about Origen is the way he doesn't just say what he thinks. He goes through all of the alternatives and why he doesn't agree with them. Mm-hmm. And so that's so helpful for people, almost 2 millennia later, trying to figure out what he thought and why. Because most people today just go, well, this is the truth, blah, 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 I believe this. It's like, well, have you thought about, these problems with that? Oh, no, there's no problems with that.
Yeah.
Like, well, do you know that everything you just said has already been refuted in the
no
in like 1,500 years ago? Like the foresight that he had, to be able to predict what people are going to say in response, and then pre-refute those responses, are really so helpful. To really get at the logic of what he's saying, which is why I like when he talks about, like when he gets into, he talks about basically like good and evil, and he talks about the why evil can't be eternal in the same sense as good,
right?
Because that would make them equals,
exactly,
instead of opposites. And like just something simple like that. It's a simple logical argument, but people don't seem to make it.
Right.
Like why does it take like so many authors to get to the one person that actually makes that point?
Yeah, I completely agree. Even to the point of like today, let's just take, for example, it's a very common thing to hear that Universalists today, like me and you, and lots of other people, David Hart, whoever, are basically just sort of Calvinists, like optimistic Calvinists.
Right.
What they end up meaning then is a certain like Dominicans, for example, will argue against me. It usually is Dominicans. That's why I say that. Not always, but is like, oh well, you haven't like considered freedom.
Okay, like libertarian freedom.
Yeah, so it's like, okay, first let's just this. I'm saying this because I actually you'll really appreciate this. Like, let's just note a few things. Like before we were to get into the debate there, like Origen, the notorious earliest, most profoundly influential Christian Universalist in history. You know why Book 3 of his On First Principles is preserved in Greek? That's because the first Philocalia, assembled by the Cappadocian Fathers, preserved it for us in Greek. And guess what's in there? His entire defense of free will against the so-called Gnostic determinists, even using Stoic terms like hegemonikon for the sort of that driving faculty within that can choose, has the power, the determination. He's got that whole discussion on self-determination as right. So it's like, it's not like Origen didn't think of freedom as like
a novel idea.
Yeah. It's like, but more interestingly, he not only thought of it, but he preempted the kind of defense of hell, as it were, by appeal to free will, by realizing that in a sense it would relapse into exactly the thing you just said, which is an absolute dualism. Because all it would mean is there's something in you that can eternally hold out against also the desire that's supposedly in you for God, who alone can satisfy you. Which means there's just the dualism isn't just a cosmic or metaphysical thing. It goes all the way to your core. You yourself are a perfect instance of an absolute dualism, and that you will label freedom and goodness. Like, that's good because you're free then. Of course, it ignores the fact that it means God's not free. It ignores the fact that it certainly means Christ isn't free. It ignores the fact that no saint or anybody that's in heaven, I suppose they cease to be free. Ignores all that stuff. But nevertheless, it's like he already sees that deeper thing. Like, and he can connect. He can do all of that already in the 3rd century, which is interesting, by the way, because just as a side comparison, Augustine also, in a few centuries after that, will preempt that same exact objection and also reject it.
Talk about that.
Yeah, but the grounds for him doing so are very different, although I don't think they're totally wrong, but they're not as well-rounded as Origen's. Look, I'm basically like a proponent of Eriugena, who in the 9th century is the 9th century Irish theologian. I would honestly say probably the last in the Western tradition prior to the last 150 years or so, who really knew some of the Greek fathers and explicitly and intentionally tried to bring them in harmony, mostly by harmony with Augustine, usually by subjecting Augustine to them. It really was. It's like, it's funny. He's got lots of strategies for that, but I won't get into all that. So I'm trying to be like Eriugena in the sense that when I see Augustine doing something that I agree with, or actually that even brings him closer to Origen, I want to point it out. Here's what I would say on this point here, or this example. Augustine also does not like the appeal to human free will as some sort of explanation for hell. And he thinks and there's a similar intuition. It's importantly different, but it is also similar in the sense that he thinks that would then mean that creation itself is not a work of God. Because if creation's outcome, like its final form, isn't exactly what God wants, then either God doesn't know how to create what God himself wants to create, which is to say he's impotent, or
what he wants is just destruction.
Exactly. Or what he wants is exactly what you get, and that would include hell. Now, Augustine, obviously, this is where he very much departs from Origen. He bites the bullet on that point and just says, yeah, God wants destruction, eternal destruction in hell for some. And if you were to ask why, there's no, be quiet. There's nothing, you don't know. Nobody can know. And who are you to ask such a question and all that?
Classic
so he's
quoting Paul on that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Romans 11:33 with
Calvinists
skipping over.
Love that one.
Yeah. But it's fascinating because at least on this point I can say, and I often do, like Origen and Augustine are closer on one point here, which is that God, the outcome of creation is ultimately and solely God's responsibility, or else it's not God's creation. On that like formal point, they actually agree, and they would agree against a lot of modern Christians who like a C.S. Lewis or like a Jacques Maritain or like a who would be a good example, like Florovsky, I guess, in the Orthodox tradition, will appeal to free will, and say, well, like God kind of wishes you would make good choices and go to heaven in the end, but he's just going to let you make bad choices and sit there and kind of like cry forever. And so, which honestly,
marvelous eschatology.
I honestly wish that was just a caricature, but I pretty much read actual things that almost exactly said that. I couldn't believe it, but
I have too.
So on that point, I think they'd be very similar. So just to sum it up and make it a little more concise and clear, Augustine rejects the free will theodicy or defense of hell simply by pointing to God's sovereignty. God is sovereign. He alone gets what he wants in the end. And so don't come at me with this like, oh, humans resisted God. Like he explicitly raises that and rejects that. It's not as if God has been overcome by human will. He says that. So he rejects it on those grounds, and he sticks within that. Origen will see, and this is what I was going to come back to earlier in terms of preempting as well. Origen's way more compelling, because yes, he agrees with Augustine that the responsibility of the outcome of creation is God's responsibility. But he also believes, precisely because God works with us, precisely because God knows how to raise us as children, precisely because God knows how to, as you said earlier, right, with the pedagogical stuff, to form the soul and develop the soul, even if it takes eons. Because he knows how to do that, he actually has a really fascinating theology of grace, where he will say, for example, sometimes God doesn't give grace and withholds it when he should give it, when it seems like he should. And other times, people that seem like they should not give grace because they've abused it so much, he will give it, almost like it's automatic. But he has this whole pedagogical view of grace where it's like, that's up to that. So what's inscrutable and what's sort of God's prerogatives and God's judgment and providence, that the realm of that is how God knows how to get to each person. And that's something that only God knows, and then maybe us as we work together. We don't even know that about ourselves. I don't even know how I'm ultimately going to be moved to finally cling to God, but God knows.
Yeah, the imagery with that would be like the great physician prescribing different remedies for different illnesses, and the illnesses themselves are not always within visibility.
Yes,
they're beyond the veil, so to speak.
Yes.
So that makes a lot of sense.
And sometimes, right, to go with that image, sometimes the cure or even the protection, right, the immunity, comes by introducing the same illness in a certain way. Other times it's the play of opposites. Like this is all the kind of Galen second century stuff, which Origen, I think, would have well known, at least the outline stuff. And so it's like this sort of, so in other words, it's the wisdom of it's the wisdom of the physician to know when to apply opposites to a disease, when to apply more of the same disease for the disease, maybe to what degree, to what intensity, do you stagger it, maybe you switch. All that stuff is prudential, wise, true, substantial knowing. And God is himself wisdom. He is prudence, is something they interestingly say. He is, right? He is the wisdom by which all things are governed, and so he knows exactly how to do that. And it's like, that's the side that Origen never lets go of, that allows his picture to be way more well-rounded, in my opinion, than Augustine. Augustine's got the logical, the coherence there of like, no, look, I mean, it's not like God can sort of be surprised by the outcome or lament the outcome, which is already amazing because most people today, that's their default. God's just sitting there wringing his hands, hoping everything works out, you know? And like Augustine would be like, what kind of God is that? You know, and Origen would agree. Yeah, what kind of God is that? But then he would go on and be like, yeah, God isn't though just a tyrant or like a monarch. Let's just put it less abrupt. He's not a monarch.
It's very much imperial imagery
yes.
out of the Augustine side.
Yes, and then whereas, like you said, for Origen and that whole tradition and through Alexandria, it's physician. You know, it's the shepherd. And it's amazing, like that text you referenced the other day that I picked up on the homily on the first homily on Jeremiah.
Yeah,
he does something similar, and I'm reading through the homilies on Psalms right now, and it's this constant. But he also knows when he knows to be a killer, so to speak, to give life and to take it away. It's only for the sake of giving life. So we're back on right. So anyway, so we've got but I love that because the common objection that you get to Universalists today. That people raise against them today is the moral laxity thing, and like, why have faith? Why care? Why even do prayers? Why go to church? Why be a Christian? And Origen's already anticipated all that. Again, I think it was already sort of dealt with by Paul, but like there's a sense of like, look, what does God really want out of creation? If he just wanted to sort of unilaterally impose, like, say, like an image or something, I mean, that he could just make a large canvas and paint on it. If he just wanted like a machine, he could obviously do that. If he just wanted a universe of pure organic life that is no self-consciousness, I don't think he actually could for other reasons. But like, let's just say, you know, it's like he could do that. At least in my mind, I can imagine that, even though I think probably it's incoherent ultimately. But he didn't do any of that. And what he actually does is he wants to do the thing that is most amazing, which is create creatures that participate in their own creation, but in such a way that their ultimate fate is not at risk. And in fact, taking off the eschatological pressure creates the atmosphere of true freedom and creativity along the way. Otherwise, we're crushed by a burden that we surely can't handle. I can't handle the idea that my kids might go to hell someday as it's normally depicted. You know, and I've actually met people that are literally psychologically tormented by this. Even to the point where they're not sure they want to have kids and all that stuff. And I know there's some Christians to be like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. It's like, well, maybe actually you're the crazy one for not thinking about that.
Yeah. Those are people who have took the logic to its natural conclusion.
Yes.
It's if that is the ultimate fate of any person, then the sin is existence.
Exactly. It would be better had they not been born, kind of thing, right? Yeah. So anyway, I think what's so amazing about Origen's picture is not only that he preempts a lot of the objections, which he does, but also that, and this is like something I'll never tire of pointing out, it gives an actual context to a very robust and salutary Christian life. This is why it has staying power in the monasteries far after it comes on hard times, because it actually makes sense of like, what are we doing here? In a way that not only do other eschatologies can't, but they actually pose scandals, in my opinion, that add to the weight and the burden, and therefore threaten a new kind of nihilism. Yes, you might call it the divine will. Sure, in a sense that's not nothing, I guess, technically. But it may as well be. Because I can't peer into it, and I have no idea why God loved Jacob and hated Esau. And Augustine explicitly says, yeah, you don't know, and you can't know, and you shouldn't ask. Nowadays, people would be like, they're not with Augustine on that, but all they come up with is enfeebling God and saying, well, Almost like even God doesn't know. Even God doesn't know how this is all going to turn out.
I wanted to for the benefit of those watching this, just briefly, we should go over, like, because people will hear about universalism and they think it's this weird thing off in the corner that nobody really looked at. So, like, people don't know that there's actually a lot of people, like a lot of big name theologians that are in this category, people who followed Origen's thought on universalism. And so we should talk about that. Like, who would you list as people who followed Origen's thinking on this, and then people who have followed Augustine on this?
Yeah. Certainly those that have followed Augustine outnumber those that have followed Origen on this, and there's lots of reasons for that. But like you said, those that have followed Origen, not only is the number not nothing, but it's also some big names. So I would list, for example, like in the wake of Origen, there were a few precursors as well, but in the wake of Origen, you would list St. Gregory of Nyssa. I would list St. Gregory the Wonder Worker. Before that, maybe he's lesser known, but St. Gregory of Nyssa, certainly massive, and you can't doubt that guy's Orthodox credentials. Present at the Council of Constantinople, very much a part of the one of the architects of the Creed that we all recite to this day, which is, like, you would think that couldn't be more Orthodox than that. Called in the Second Council of Nicaea, the Father of the Fathers. So that's Gregory of Nyssa. There are some scholars today that try to argue that Gregory of Nyssa is not a universalist. They're very bad arguments. And don't take it just from me, a universalist. I just read a year or so ago, Father Brian Daly, he's maybe like a Balthazarian sort of hopeful universalist. So he doesn't he's unduly biased in a certain way or whatever. But he's like, you can almost, and he's well advanced in age at this point, but still, pretty sharp. And he did a translation for SVS, Popular Patristics, something like on death and eternal life. There's 7 treatises in there, or works in there by Gregory of Nyssa, and you can tell in the introduction, especially, Father Daly is just like exasperated that anyone would even doubt that Gregory of Nyssa is universal. So anyway, we don't have to get into all the details, but
yeah,
the case there is against him.
Insane.
It's ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. It's unbelievably motivated by a lot of weird things. But anyway, so I'd say Gregory of Nyssa. I think there's a pretty good argument to be made for Gregory of Nazianzus, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, the Gregory the Theologian. And then Basil Caesarea he's just typically more conservative in what he says. I would guess he's more of he's more of like a monastic mindset of like, this is probably true, but we ought not to say that because it could be damaging to people that don't understand what we're really saying. It could encourage them to sort of, moral antinomianism. So anyway, so you pretty much got certainly one Cappadocian father, no question. You got another one that's pretty much obvious, and then you got another one that's very probable. Who else? We got Evagrius Ponticus. Sure, he later on falls on tough times and criticism, and yet everybody's using his practical spiritual works to this day. I mean, in all the monasteries, he's certainly a universalist. Let's see. We got, you've already mentioned Saint Isaac of Nineveh, probably one of the most important spiritual writers in the East.
Yeah.
And awkward for a lot of people, his most it's not that he's only a universalist in this text. That's something that's a misunderstanding out there. But the very, very most explicit statements come in what's called the second part of one of his major works, and that wasn't discovered until it was discovered in its Syriac translation in the mid to late 20th century by Sebastian Bach, I think. And so
I bet that was pretty awkward for a lot of people when they found that.
Oh yeah. Well, I've even heard.
Like, oh man,
there's some people in your corner of the woods, Ambrose, that have apparently starting to promise that in a year or so that's going to be shown to be fraudulent. So there you go.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
everything that we don't like in history has got to be some kind of interpolation.
Exactly. It's an old now granted it's got a venerable tradition as a tactic, but yeah. So okay, so we got St. Isaac of Nineveh. Now, look, I would say that I think Dionysius the Areopagite, St. Dionysius was probably a universalist. I mean, everything suggests that he would at least it would sort of the consistency would go there. And then I say this as someone who doesn't. I need to make this caveat. I don't need St. Maximus the Confessor to be a universalist for me to be one. It's just not the way.
Can I make like a little intro to that?
Yes, please.
So when getting into Maximus, when I was studying Origen, like you mentioned before, his homily in Jeremiah, that is like the most important thing for people to read to understand how Origen interprets destruction, what destruction means, because that's when he goes into he talks about Paul, that God destroyed Paul the persecutor to give life to Paul the apostle, and like that is like a foundation point for why Origen is universalist.
Yes.
Now, the reason why this is important to bring out as a question for Maximus is because Maximus uses the identical logic for his commentary on Jonah, saying that Nineveh was destroyed.
Yes.
So his understanding of destruction is the same as Origen's.
Yes.
So it's kind of a hard sell to say that Maximus wasn't a universalist if that's his definition of destruction.
Yes.
Is that fair?
It's completely fair, and we could even take it in other directions where that same logic is on display strikingly. So, for example, I always bring this up around that same text that you're referencing in Maximus, where you have he's alluding to a few different texts. One of them is Jude. Another one is a certain text in the Psalms, like around Psalm 82 or something, about bonds. I'm bound together, and sort of the bonds, the darkness are coming above me, or whatever. It's like this line. Anyway, he explicitly says that the bonds they're called eternal. I think in the Septuagint translation, it's eternal bonds, or right, the aeonic bonds, or whatever, right, that we talked about earlier, and you can connect that with Jude and the fallen angels, them being bound, shackled. Now, Maximus also says there are our own, I think the exact quote is, our own interior attachments to material things, like in a diluted way. So he's already doing a little bit of figurative reading in some of this stuff. But the important thing is this. He then says, so you've got this image, which would be a classically infernalist image. And in fact, it's funny because people that come at me with like, oh, you're sort of reading your universalism into Maximus. It's funny because they never cite what I would consider the best proof text against me. I know the infernalist passages in Maximus better than they do, and I don't know why they don't use them, because I would if I were fighting me. And it's these obscure texts like question 11 from response to question Thalassius. Okay. There you will get a statement like this again with the bonds. It says their bonds there. He's talking about fallen angels. Their bonds are eternal. They are forever locked in their own misery, and their will never be turned. Wow. That sounds very infernalist, right? This is like the locking in, even if you do a C.S. Lewis thing, nevertheless, it's just total, right? It's closure. Mm-hmm. Here's the point. In the text that I was right before that, I was discussing this, where you're talking about the Jonah gloss. He specifically says, when he's talking about the harrowing of hell, the descent of Christ into Hades, he says that those same bonds, which are eternal, are broken. So this concept, which I've come to say now in a nice small term to reference that whole logic that you're talking about, that traces all the way back to Origen, and as you of course know, all the way back to the New Testament.
Yep.
Is I would call it the broken eternity. That phrase, that little broken eternity is exactly the thing that nobody seems to think is possible, but it's the heart of the logic that you just referenced. And it's both in Origen and it's in Maximus. It's amazing because there's this whole literature discussing Maximus and whether or not he's a universalist that's been going on since since the 60s. And nobody talks about this. And I'm like, how do you go and read Maximus, or really almost any of some of these guys? It makes you want to reread a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
How do you read? Certainly, if they're in the monastic tradition, in particular, if they're influenced by Origen at all, in particular, it's like, how do you go through and just proof text and say, well, look, here we've got the fires of hell. Great, you probably have on your own file somewhere a whole bunch of texts in Origen where he does that too. I could point to text in Evagrius Ponticus where he says you ought to contemplate the fires of hell.
Yeah.
Like, we could all do this, right? That's not
Right.
interesting. That's not interesting.
Right.
It's not really a profound or careful thinking, especially about matters so important as this. And so I would say, like, when you really start to get like that insight you just said, and then you go read and you say, well, Maximus, sure, you can find those texts where he says that. But his whole point is what seems impossible under a limited horizon, which is self-enclosing, self-referential, and has its own like logical coherence, is not therefore ultimately impossible. And by the way, lo and behold, Origen in his commentary on Romans makes exactly that point about different kinds of eternity.
Yep.
In fact, he brings together there a few things you've said. One, the inherent limitedness of evil, and it can't be eternally opposed to the good because you have two dueling principles. Two, different levels or types of eternity. And three, one must win out over the other, right? So if that picture is even close to being right, or if somebody just has that picture like Maximus does, how could you possibly not consider that when you're talking about what for him is possible or not from what stage of the progression we're on? I don't get it. So, but that's almost entirely left out. In fact, I think it is entirely left out of the discussion about those that are fighting over Maximus. So I think he is a universalist, but I think you have to consider all that stuff.
Now, the question becomes like, how did it become so unclear what Maximus believes?
Yeah.
Is now my speculation, and I'm going to ask you what you think. My speculation is there's probably Universalist ideas were derailed at the imperial level by Justinian. And then by the time Maximus comes around, it's like a hush-hush thing that he can't openly say much about it.
Yeah.
But he can at least provide the logic that if you follow it, you end up there.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's so. I would point to two or maybe three, if I can remember the third thing I was thinking about, but two things in particular. One is we'll start. It's what you said. Justinian is a complicated figure, but let's just say, as you know, and I think I've heard you say this too. Like, look, Justinian, I actually am one who thinks he's a little more interesting theologically than some people think. I mean, at least in Christology. I think his Christology is actually pretty good. And I actually am glad that he made what we now refer to as Neo-Chalcedonianism as kind of like the concealer, like he pushed for that. Now, the downside, of course, is that he had to make some political moves for the sake of that Christological fight. And one of the moves that he makes clearly is and I think this also partly explains the whole thing about whether or not the anti-Origenist canons are really a part of 553, all that stuff, right? That council, Constantinople II. Okay, I don't even think, to be honest with you, I don't even think you have to argue on that level, although people have done that, and that's fine. I mean, I don't need them to, I'd be just happy. I'd be absolutely happy if they weren't authentic at all to that council.
Yeah, I've completely abandoned making that point.
The truth is
you
don't need to. I mean, you really don't. You know this, but it's like the canon's own language. I just constantly point to that. Like, look, I will give you your best case. Let's say they were there at 553, and let's say all the council fathers like read them. It was read aloud. They signed and said, yes, that's great. Let's say that that's true. There's a lot of question marks there, but let's just say that's true. That is not, you will not find universalism condemned at 553. That's such a bad caricature of what's going on there. It also betrays honestly a profound impatience in the thinking of people who supposedly are thinking with the church, but they're utterly inattentive to the details of what the church ever says.
Yeah.
So in that instance, just real quick, and then we'll get back to the thing about the two reasons why Maximus is sort of characterized this way. One is that in those canons, it explicitly says that the apokatastasis that is there in view and condemned is the, quote, that which follows necessarily upon that monstrosity called the preexistence of souls or whatever. Okay, number one. So if you don't have an eschatology that depends on a primordial hinad or whatever the details are, they're not really even given.
Yeah.
Then that's not the apokatastasis that they're talking about. I mean, they've given you a qualification. They didn't say there's no canon that says universalism is anathema.
Right.
You won't even find the word. There's no canon that says apokatastasis is anathema. There's only a canon that says the one that follows upon this apokatastasis, which follows upon this other protological thing view. Okay, then there's another qualification they give in a later canon in that same list. What is that one? If in that apokatastasis all names, numbers, and bodies are obliterated. In other words, they're thinking of an amorphous mass, a return, a restoration, which actually obliterates the good, richness, and multiplicity of creation. Okay, I don't think that either. So if I don't think, if it doesn't depend, and the word's very clear, it follows upon, like that's the phrase in Greek, it follows upon. It's necessary. In fact, the necessity is said. If it doesn't follow upon a protology that has a preexistence of souls, that's more or less undefined anyway. But then it goes, the character, the eschatological, the character of your eschaton isn't one that obliterates all difference. Then they're not talking about your apokatastasis. That's how you think with councils. That's how you think in history. You don't just say Constantinople II condemned universalism. That, my friend, is the least traditional way to think because it utterly ignores the details in the tradition. So I don't buy that at all. I think it just needs to be clarified. Okay, sorry, a little bit of a hobby horse there. You really got me going, Ambrose. My kids leave the house, and here I am now. I'm just
that's great.
Now I'm just yelling at a screen. But okay. So anyway, but okay. Skipping all of that stuff now. It is still true. I mean, likely true. There's arguments here, but let's just say Origen is named. Origen, Didymus the Blind, and Evagrius are named. That was a Justinian political move. Why? Because he needed to get something called the 3 chapters condemned, and there were some names associated with like Theodoret, Theodore, and Theodore as well.
Theodore Mossus.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so you look, guys, it's not hard to see. You got 3 and 3. You give us 3 hostages, I'll give you 3. It's an exchange. Okay, so it's like, although this is, I guess, the opposite. We're taking each other's hostages. Okay. So that's how he did it, and it's very clear that the whole reason for the council and like Justinian's major proximate target was the 3 chapters people, because the whole thing was the Christological fight. That was the real thing. But then he has to get some of these Origen factions, like guys like Leontius of Byzantium. He's got to get some other support, especially from Palestine, in order for this to go through. And so they request, not Leontius, because he actually is an Origenist of his own sort, but some other people were like, well, so they name them. But okay, what do we got then? We got a name. We don't know why. What about Origen? Oh, it's just Origen's, Origen and his impieties. Great. Okay, so if he doesn't have impieties, I guess he's not condemned. Like, I don't know. Also,
what makes it even more awkward is Athanasius calls Origen a church father in De Decretis 627, and he's using Origen's Christology to argue against Arius.
Absolutely.
And it's like hilarious because the irony of like calling him a heretic and yet your Christology is like founded on this so-called heretic.
Actually, that's really important. Let's put a pin in that for a second, because my second reason actually is going to come back to this. There's a very particular contemporary reason, I think even from the Orthodox side. Now, you could speak better on this, but I'm going to throw this out to you, and I have a strong suspicion, but I wonder what you think of it. But keep a pin in like that point with Athanasius using Origen. Origen certainly, talk about preempting, he certainly preempts Arianism and eunomianism. He rejects it on first principles like 3 times.
Yeah.
Right?
And I would add Sabellianism.
Exactly. Totally.
And that's his argument against Sabellianism created a certain semantic that people think is subordinationist. That's my belief. That's based on the research.
Which honestly, of course, that's going to sound that way initially.
Right.
Everyone that was true.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problematic, right? Is how if you're going to affirm the distinctness of the 3. But then then what do you do with like sort of the one, the preeminence of the one? Okay, that's just the whole task. So anyway,
you emphasize different things depending on who you're talking to.
Exactly, which is what you find in Origen's actual writings. Okay, so but other things too, just on that little like Gregory of Nyssa. I mean, you just read the preface to his homilies on the Song of Songs, where he explicitly said, in fact, he almost feels like he has to apologize for publishing these homilies on Song of Songs when Origen's already done it so well in his commentary, right? Gregory didn't seem to have the same hang-ups around Origen as even some of his contemporaries did at that time in the first Origen's controversy. Okay, but anyway, so I keep a pin in that because actually it's going to come back in the second reason. So the historical reason, sorry to draw this up, the historical reason is, yes, Justinian, the political maneuvering, we'll throw their names, the Origenist names in there, and we'll condemn Origenism, like broadly, abstractly, with very little detail. And it kind of affects this sort of temporary truce. That's fine. And it is true that creates a culture or an environment after, where there's a kind of sense that one has to distance oneself from Origen in order to have orthodox credentials. In fact, when Maximus is at one of his trials, he's accused of promoting the doctrines of Origen. Why is that?
Interesting.
Maybe because they're very similar. Now I don't, judge him how you will. I don't quite know what to make of it. Maximus twice will say, I condemn. I mean, it's a sort of, it's a generic, it's an interesting way to do it. He says, I condemn Origen and all of his madnesses. Now, obviously, the counterfactual, would be, well, if he doesn't have madnesses, then you wouldn't be condemning him, right? So, okay, but that usually can pass. So there's a kind of environment, culture, a political angle to this where Origen explicitly embracing Origen becomes an issue for a lot of people. Now, in Maximus's case, he explicitly, I don't necessarily think he has a problem with saying things in in substantial doctrines or teachings or ways of interpreting things that are actually not only just as extreme as some of the people that have fallen on hard times, but I found a few places where he seems to go even further. In fact, further than Origen on some things. And so I don't. Maximus is so interesting because on the one hand, he knows how to play that game of like, well, yeah, and I'm not going to associate with that name, but at the same time, and he will have passages where he says, I'm refuting. He doesn't say Origen in those ones, but like a story that's very much attributed to Origen and people would think is Origen's view, even though it's not really. So all that to say, because of those sort of political dynamics, and then Maximus's sort of refutation of what 20th century scholars call Origenism. One way that Maximus has made a comeback in the 20th century is under the aegis of the guy who sort of finally gave the actual answer to Origen, back to Origenism. And so like in some great scholars, including Balthasar, this guy named Polycarp Sherwood, early 20th century, they'll write whole studies on Maximus's anti-Origenism. So that was a long sort of circuitous way to answer to give you the first part of the answer to your question, which is, since then Maximus is kind of introduced to us or recuperated in the West, especially, as like this particularly brilliant person who can, yes, sort of take some of Origen's good insights and retain them, but also at the same time refute Origen. And like, that's really what he's doing. then
So
the question
was
of
Maximus salvaged as an apologetics agenda
yeah,
in
there's
history?
a part of that. Some of the people I named. Here's what I think: the actual really good scholars like Balthazar, Sherwood, even Larcher to some extent, although I have some issues with him. They know better. And so they're going to give you all the qualifications, like, he also accepted some things from Origen, but still it remains pretty vague. And so you can easily come away with from some of that literature, that scholarship, and say, he refuted Origenism. There's a whole book's written like that. And then, yes, it gets taken up into the apologetic sort of pro-Orthodox, it was right to condemn Origen sort of movements.
Mm-hmm.
And Maximus becomes an exemplar of this. So imagine if you've got Maximus that you've recuperated not only as the champion of orthodoxy, but as the one who refutes Origen and purifies the Orthodox tradition of his, of his lingering viral effects or something. Then how awkward would it be if Origen not only employs the same logic, but develops it in such a way that he even lands on, like, say, the same eschatology? And actually, what I would want to say, here's my quick thing with Maximus. I think Maximus purges certain elements in the content of what came to be called Origenism, but actually he only ever does that to reinforce the form of Origenian thinking. And then some of the actual contents as well. Like, I think he's actually best understood not simply as a refuter of Origen, but as the great creative synthesizer of Origen. And like any great synthesizer, you're going to cut off some things that were loose ends, or you're going to tie them up, or you're going to sort of tidy it up. But you're not destroying it. You're actually cultivating it so that it can grow to a greater stage, right? And I think that's actually, if you're going to give a quick summary of Maximus's relation to Origen, it should be something like that rather than just a purely negative, destructive one. Okay, so that's the second one's really way quicker and probably more interesting. That first one then was just historically, yes, Maximus is caught up in the kind of political game of distancing himself from Origen while he's still using, and I would even argue, greatly synthesizing and cultivating Origen. And so it's easy to retrieve him for ends today to resist Origen and all that, Gnostic infused, Universalist sort of thinking that's as if it's a foreign agent infiltrating the Christian tradition. But then I think the last part, and this is we'll return then to the pens there, is that Maximus is supposed to be then, he becomes like a symbol. Maximus is orthodoxy. Maximus is the pure orthodoxy, right? The unblemished, the unpolluted, the unalloyed. And because we're so confident in our apologetic points, like the Council of Constantinople II certainly, quote unquote, condemned universalism, or because we're so confident that Origen is, quote unquote, just a heretic, and because then we can even make moves like this, like, you notice how those Catholics last century were really interested in Origen? That's why we're not so easily swayed, even though he's in our own tradition. There's all these ways in which, in the especially American Orthodox world, being anti-Origen is being Orthodox. And so you can't say Maximus is not Orthodox. Not even the most twisted Jay Dyer type person can do that. So you need him to be that symbol. You need him to be the anti-Origen, therefore Orthodox figure. And so, no, we don't have time for these nuances about the broken eternity, the fact that he's using Origen's own logic. We can't deal with all that, right? Who has time for that? Who has time for the actual wording of the canons of the council? Let's just appeal to the council generically, right? So, I think that gets taken up into all that as well. And so,
I think a lot of that is probably the fault of guys like Vladimir Lasky and a lot of these anti-Origen Neopalamite kind of people who, like Losky, I think I can recall in his mystical theology, the only time he mentions Origen is to use Origen as a bad example. Like completely just Origen is just like his value is just for a polemical talking point.
Which is so funny. Like, think about this. This is the part where I'm like, look, both my Hegel starts to show what he calls the cunning of reason and history, or I would just call, and actually he does too, divine providence, like working out through all of our meanderings, somehow still bringing something together. Because I do think the Catholic, like the Western, the Protestant, especially the Catholic sort of relationship to like Origen and the tradition, it's funny because on the one hand, as we've already discussed with Augustine and all that, Augustine overshadows all that. And so Origen's more or less pushed out, especially after Eriugena. And for a while, Origen becomes sort of that in the West, although not as vociferous because it's just like distant, right? It's just kind of like, but he's mentioned, like Aquinas will mention, and he'll mention his name and he'll criticize what he thinks. I mean, little chance he actually read Origen, but a small chance, I should say. But what's funny is then like you get all the way to like the 19th century and just look at how great this is, like set next to what you just said about Losky. Pope Leo the 13th. And we just have a Pope Leo the 14th. Okay, this is good timing.
Yeah.
Pope Leo the 13th, in an encyclical, the first one ever, to deal with modern biblical studies. And a kind of fervor to, like, on the one hand, try to, like, stop seeming so retrograde and just reactionary, but still being very much a pope who's, like, kind of anti-modern. He's the one who sets up Aquinas as, like, the Catholic sort of thinker, all that stuff. But it's amazing because in the middle of this encyclical, it's called Proventissimus something or other, but it's on modern biblical studies in the modern research into the Bible, historical criticism. He holds up Origen as the greatest exegete in the patristic era,
as you should,
and it's so funny because it's like, well, hold on, okay, so partly what's driving him is like an anti-modernist apologetic, but he still wants to retain the kind of street cred or the scholarly cred for the Christian tradition, specifically a return to the fathers in the pre-modern era. But it's like, well, look at Origen. He was the greatest exegete in all the patristic era, and he still did all the, like, you know, he knew the languages and stuff and was doing manuscript work all the way back then. But also he had a way of elevating, you know, like, so he starts to he commends Origen's way of reading the Bible as like the best example. Mm-hmm. And so so it's not by accident that like some of the main Catholic thinkers of the 20th century all wrote books on Origen. De Lubac, Balthazar, Jean Danielou, all these people, right? A lot of these people that are in the quote unquote Origen revival in the West were Catholics. Okay, so it's like, so it's just so funny that it's like the tradition that kind of has obvious claim to Origen is trying to now distance themselves from him. And then that affects how they like receive Maximus and what they allow him to think. And
that was also Erasmus's final work before he died. He was working on Origen.
He loved him. I mean, he's like, this is the guy. Like, obviously, that's why Erasmus is great too. But so anyway, so you know, I don't know. So I think the two obstacles specifically are the historical in his historical era, Maximus sort of has to sort of be a little bit judicious about how he says things sometimes in certain context. And then the other thing, though, is that I think that today, like our context, a lot of people need Maximus to be a certain thing for them.
Yeah. Yeah. The polemical temptation of Maximus, right?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, there's so many things in history that just make it so awkward. Like, even, like, because I mentioned Athanasius, like, using Origen as an authority.
Oh, yeah.
And, like, even what you said about, like, well, the universalism that was condemned was the one that was founded on the presupposition of the preexistence of souls. Okay. Well, you have St. Pamphilus of Caesarea writing an entire apology defending Origen on the preexistence of souls, calling it the most reasonable of all the metaphysical options.
Some in Augustine, too. There are some passages in Augustine that it seem to pretty much subscribe to. He never wants to be dogmatic about it, but neither did Origen necessarily. Yeah. So,
and the other irony is that Origen is, you could trace the reason why Origen became a Christian, Augustine became a Christian, back to Origen.
Absolutely.
Because it was Ambrose of Milan giving an Origenian sermon on Genesis that convinced Augustine, oh, hey, maybe the Christians aren't all idiots.
Exactly. He explicitly says it in Confessions. Yeah. And it's one other point, actually, and this is actually a bigger point maybe that I was going to make. I wonder what you think. I think there's this other deeper thing going on under all of this today. I've experienced this on some occasion in certain... I don't at all attribute to this to all Orthodox by any means. I'm not trying to just criticize the Orthodox all the time. I'm sure you could do that. But there's also a way in which this kind of stuff that you and I have just been citing has this, it really strikes to the core of what I would call a certain Orthodox epistemology, like the phronema of the fathers. Mm-hmm. Because how often is there some kind of gesture or argument made that goes something like this? Well, so-and-so is so holy.
Yeah, I hate that argument.
How could they possibly be wrong? But then you're in a bind, really.
Yeah.
Because if you're like anti-Origen and you need Maximus to be this or whatever, and you have this view of orthodoxy, well, how could Athanasius do what he did with Origen? Right. How could St. Gregory of Nyssa say what he said about Origen? How could, you go down the list, Gregory of Nazianzus, Origen's the whetstone of us all. Like, how can God, like you could just turn that around and you can see how awkward this becomes? Because it's like, how could those saints, these holy men, these great Orthodox champions and defenders of orthodoxy, how could they not know that Origen was a wolf in sheep's clothing? So that now all of a sudden your whole way of like categorizing and judging what's true or false is put in question.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. Like, I fully agree with what you said.
Good. I'm not just making it up.
Yeah, it's what gets stated is the way it's phrased. Like you mentioned, the phronema thing. People love the word phronema.
That's why I threw it in there for you.
Like they'll talk about like the church as this like entity that exists as like, oh, we don't follow the imagined errors of Gregory of Nyssa or something like that. We side with the church. Like, well, what the heck does that mean? The church. Gregory of Nyssa was part of the church. Like, I'm siding with the church because I side with Gregory of Nyssa. Like, how do you refute that argument?
Yeah.
What they actually mean, without saying it or without even realizing it, is that they just side with the imperial decrees.
Yeah.
Whatever some ex-authority says, that's the church, not you or me or anyone else, just them. And you have to choose which century, because
exactly.
they're not all the same. They got some Arians, right?
Yeah.
So who's the church, right? It's never defined.
Yeah.
And it annoys me so much the way it's the language around this, because it's so unhelpful and people don't really understand what they're saying.
Yeah, it's every tradition's got its fundamentalism, I guess, and the temptation is that the simpler and clearer everything is made, the purer it must be. And so, you got Catholics on our side that do that with the magisterium, the tradition, and it's like all of a sudden when Pope Francis starts saying stuff that they just even whiffs at something they don't like, or all of a sudden says like, oh, the death penalty actually is wrong. All of a sudden they get all nuanced about what the magisterium actually is. Now, But yeah, Orthodoxy has its version of that, and
Yeah,
of course,
it's not different.
Protestantisms that we've both experienced have that too. So
Yeah.
mm-hmm.
So you could talk about what did the Catholic Church, how would you contrast the development of like what the Catholic Church used to teach about the afterlife and hell and all of that versus what they teach now?
Yeah. So I think for most of the history of the Catholic Church, when I say that, I mean all the way up to the Council of Trent, post-Reformation era, is like I like to characterize it in three ways. I do this in a talk that I've done before, where you do the cause of hell, the character of hell, and the census or the occupancy of hell. And in each of these respects, the church has more or less developed into its opposite, with some nuance. But like in the first instance, like the cause of hell, we've touched on it a little bit with St. Augustine, and a lot of this goes back to St. Augustine in one form or another. For Augustine, the cause of hell is kind of twofold. One, like I would say I think this is maybe a character. I don't know if it's a caricature, but it's a simplification. But I don't see that it's that inaccurate. He thinks basically the first parents are maybe they're in a position that they could go either way, for God or against God, to heaven, as it were, or to hell, right? And there's really no history preceding them. So there's not like there's some kind of inertia or movement in one direction or another. It's like an actual sort of neutral thing. They obviously fail, however you interpret Genesis. He's not necessarily beholden to a literal one, but he thinks the teaching of it, one way or the other, is that they fail. And so this is his doctrine of original sin then, that now that failure is passed on through the origination of subsequent generations in humanity that you and I are part of. And so, in a sense, but he thinks that condemns all of their progeny to hell. He literally, like you've heard the term before, massa damnata, which is, you could just like the damned mass or majority, but also massa in the Latin, as a little bit in English and German, has the sense of like big clump of stuff. So the massa that's damned, the mass that's damned, is really the whole clump of humanity, a lump of humanity. He uses that language. And so he thinks original sin, it merits damnation. That means it ends in hell, and that everybody is born into original sin. So everybody is born into a state in which they are with the lump of which they're a member, they're rolling down the hill into, the infernal lake or something. And that's, in a sense, that's the cause. But then that means, you understand that apart from an idea of preexistence, unless he had that would be a different thing. And he flourished with that because I think he sees some benefits to it. But if you take the late Augustine on it, just cut that off and just say, no, God chooses when you're going to be born. You're born, and you're born into a state of original sin. And you're already, as it were, on the road to hell, down, like rolling down the mountain.
Thanks, God.
Thanks, God. Couldn't you have made me a first parent? At least I'd have a better chance, right? But like, okay, so in a sense, you could say the reason why people go to hell is because they're born into and with original sin. But that's not quite right, because there is a really crucial other factor, which we've already mentioned, which is that for Augustine, if God chooses to give you grace, you can be plucked out of the lump that's headed to hell, and you can be sent to heaven. That is predestination.
Yeah.
That's God's sovereignty. That's his will. That's his election. That's grace. Okay. So what I think is just consistent to say, and I don't think it's necessarily unfair to Augustine, it's actually just being fair to the whole logic here. You would just say, okay, so there's kind of two causes for hell in the end. One is original sin, and then the other one is God simply withholding. The way Augustine phrases it in one text, he says, God chooses unwillingness to give grace. He just doesn't want to give it. He withholds it. Because if he had chosen to, he would go to heaven.
Would you say, because it sounds to me that's almost a false category, because God is ultimately the creator of that situation.
Exactly.
Intentionally.
So, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Like, so, right. So it's like a hypothetical moment that clarifies something. But no, yeah, exactly. He does not accept what some of the later tradition will try to do in the West and try to come up with all these distinctions and categories. He doesn't think there is an actual thing like God's, like say for example, God's, let's see, the consequent will, I'm forgetting the distinction. Consequent will, and John of Damascus mentions it.
I forget.
Hold on, I really got to get this because I'll get mad. I have it in my thing. Antecedent. Geez, how did I forget that? Antecedent, right? Just prior to any consideration. So like, yeah, no, Augustine wouldn't think there's such a thing as like God sort of has a general will for everyone. He wishes everyone to go to heaven, but then consequently, if they don't choose, he won't let, he won't get what he wanted originally. No, none of that. So that's why I think it's actually very fair to Augustine, to his own logic, to say, no, there really are two causes, so to speak, or at the very least, let's just say two essential conditions for you to go to hell. One is that you are born into original sin. Well, that's everybody's condition. You don't even have a choice there. Well, you really don't have a choice for the second one either, because then the other condition is God withholds grace that would save you from that condition of original sin and damnation. If those two conditions are met, God doesn't give grace, and you're born into original sin, then you go to hell. So the causes of hell are that. Okay. Well, the church is completely flipped on that. Even to this day, the catechism, all that stuff. Now, what's taught, this is easy, and I think this is the most intuitive for people. Now, why you go to hell isn't simply because you're born into original sin, but because you just actually sin personally. It's not like a thing you simply contract at birth. And even if you do contract that at birth, even if somebody is a proponent of original sin, like right now, a Catholic theologian, they still don't necessarily, it's not even clear anymore that alone sends you to hell, because there's a certain case like the unbaptized infant that used to be, another change here, used to be they're either going to go to hell or they're going to go to limbo, which is still a part of hell. Now in fact, it's pretty much the predominant position in the Catholic world that they don't go to hell at all. They go to heaven. Or at the very least, they're quote unquote commended to God's ultimate mercy that he could do what he wants with. So they could all go to heaven. Okay, so now it's like original sin's not enough for you to go to hell. You also have to personally be a sinner. And then that adds then the second point. Well, what about God's grace? Well, even that can be resisted. So now the reason why you go to hell is you. You are the reason why you go to hell. That's exactly before it was the situation you're born into and God's choice. Mm-hmm. Now it's neither of those two edges. It's you in the middle making the wrong or right choice. You make the wrong choice, you're the cause of your own hell. So that's a huge flip in terms of who's like effecting the state of hell for anyone. Now the teaching is mostly it's just yourself. Augustine would point out that's a little bit of a problem, because if I'm the cause of my own hell, then why would I not be the cause of my own heaven? That's his kind of tough one that we basically just sort of ignore. So, okay, there's that. The character of hell, this is an easy one. It's basically gone from like Dante's Inferno, God engineering, actively punishing, imposing punishments on you to match, in retribution to what you did. So it's a very active, like it's almost like a sense that God's justice is being fulfilled, like it's being expressed in a way that it needs to come forth. Now, no, none of that. Now, in the Catechism and the last few popes, all this stuff, now it's God is passive and is simply wishing you wouldn't send yourself to hell. And what you really experience in hell, the character of hell now, is not God punishing you with his justice or in his just sort of sentences. But now you're just experiencing the natural consequences of your own self-separation from God. The way that the Catechism today puts it is a definitive self-exclusion. And then you just sort of suffer, right? So everything that like if you don't have God, you're not united with God, you're always going to be discontent and suffering because God alone can satisfy. If you're not united with God in beauty, then all you're going to experience is ugly because God alone is beauty, right? Etc. Go down the thing. So it's all like natural consequences. And this is why those people will appeal now to St. Isaac of Nineveh, because that's what they like that all of a sudden.
Yeah.
So that's been a major change. The last one, and actually probably the starkest change, has been in the senses, or like the groups or the people that will or won't be in heaven or hell. It used to be, obviously, with the Massa Damnata, most people are going to hell. And certainly groups like pagans that don't believe in Christ, so they include like atheists or whoever, but also other religions. Jews are going to go to hell if they don't accept Jesus. Unbaptized infants are going to go to hell. You Orthodox are going to go to hell. And schismatics like the Protestants are going to go to hell. So lots of people are going to hell. And probably most Catholics. So, because, the Catholic guilt thing, and we're all bad anyway. And so like most people are going to go to hell. Now, especially post-Vatican II, every single one of those categories has been reversed. It's actually a teaching today of the Catholic Church that somebody can be an atheist, not believe in God explicitly, but will the good and live a good life. And this is called, quote, the baptism of desire, which invisibly unites them to the church, even though they don't at all consider themselves an adherent or member of a church. And that through the church, therefore, they will still be saved. Now, the Catholic Church is not at the point that, of course, I would want to push towards, where they say that is what's going to happen, but it is a possibility for all. John Paul II, for example, explicitly states that. Okay, that is a huge reversal, because I could point to texts, really authoritative texts from popes and stuff in the Middle Ages that literally said, in fact, they said, if you don't submit to the Roman pontiff, to the Pope, before you die, so even if you're a Christian, so again, you Orthodox, they're saying this to the Armenian Orthodox. Then you will go to hell, right? It's an explicit thing. And there's anyway, so like that whole thing has been reversed. And it's actually kind of an amazing, you can go down, you can get to the specifics of, like, for example, in one council in the Middle Ages talks about schismatics, and really you could tell what they mean as Orthodox, but also ones that specifically like oppose, like the Council of Chalcedon. So like Oriental Orthodox. Yeah. Well, what do we do with the fact that today, in the Roman Catholic Church, we have 21 Coptic Orthodox martyrs who were killed by ISIS that are now in our martyrology? They're considered saints. When you are considered a saint, you're in heaven. Yeah. So you're not in hell. So it's like, so anyway, that's like and what's amazing is both Cyprian of Carthage in the 3rd century, North Africa, and Augustine anticipated that possible scenario, not ISIS particularly, but the idea that someone who is outside of the Catholic Church is still Christian and they die for that Christian faith. They explicitly raise that case hypothetically and say, even that does not make you saved. Oof. Even your martyrdom does not. Whereas today, some people talk about an ecumenism of martyrdom or of blood. Yeah. Where one way maybe we could start to reunite with each other is by mutual recognition of each other's martyrs as our own, which is a really lovely, I think, a beautiful one way forward. It's a very beautiful thing. But it's like the very fact that I'm recognizing that beauty, but think about it. It's the exact opposite of not only what was like considered. It's not that just wasn't considered. It was actually considered and like often explicitly rejected. Yeah. So that's my rundown.
It's no wonder why Augustine thought it so scandalous that there could exist people on the other side of the earth because the missionaries can't get there.
Yeah, I mean,
with that kind of mentality, it makes sense, right?
Right, and so then you get the whole discovery of the New World or whatever. Like that's
like whoopsie.
That's when a lot of this, like a lot of people point to, like when they're like that trajectory I just sketched out for you, like the kind of unbelievable sort of reversals there. a lot of people point to, like, in terms of a historical and like sociological major architectonic shift, they'll point to that, the discovery of the New World, the native people who've never, for hundreds and hundreds of generations, never even heard of, like, could never have been accessed. Like they'll point to that as like when the church started to kind of shift and maybe start to become a little more self-critical about some of these doctrines that we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's very interesting,
to say the least.
Yeah, my own perspective on the mechanics of hell has really shifted post researching NDEs.
Interesting.
Because I think it's fascinating how so many people report experiencing what they've done to other people through literally like through the body of that person.
Yes.
Like as if they were that person.
Yes. Wow.
And you could experience yourself through that perspective of everyone that you've come in contact with. And that's what made it clicked for me that's hell.
Yes.
Encountering your negative actions to everyone you've ever met in a single moment.
Yes.
And like coming face to face with who you are.
Yes.
Is like that. That's just the perfect way to see it.
Yeah.
And it just clicked for me.
That's totally right. I mean, it's the fact that Christ is in all things is the condition for the possibility of what you just said. Because if I'm in Christ and Christ is in me, but Christ is, according, like, for example, to Colossians 3:11, I always refer to that, where Christ will be and be in all, then what that means is the process of Christ becoming, being, and becoming in all is actually the same thing as like you yourself are an aspect of that process, in that you will be able to access the thing you just said. Mm-hmm. That empathy, I mean, what is that but empathy to its absolute degree?
Right.
You will literally be able to experience that as them, as you as them. Mm-hmm. And so then, like, these verses start to get a whole new, you will be condemned, like your own words will condemn you.
Right.
That's not just a nice flowery way.
Right.
Maybe it was originally, but what it can now also
like literally
mean, exactly, literally. But the actual allegorical read,
right,
which is to say, pointing to the actual mysteries of things, the realities that these words are about, is what you just said.
Yeah,
like you will literally experience yourself, and then you will condemn what you yourself did to this person who is also you. You know, like,
right.
I actually have a pretty close relation of mine has had experience like that, but as a victim.
Mm.
And just briefly, if you don't mind, it's just a kind of anecdote, but it's one that I've always, also for me, this is where that thing you said, this is where it clicked, is when he was telling me about this, because I immediately said, this is divine judgment. That's what that is. He was a victim of some sort of some predatory sexual assault from a babysitter, over time. I can't remember how long, but a considerable amount of time. And so he's been working through all these things, later in life as an adult, as we all sort of do. And he did a lot of things, therapy, regular stuff like counseling, but also did like healing prayer. And in the healing prayer sessions, he would have these very vivid visions. He didn't know how to categorize them. But there was many different kinds, but a subset of those was him going back and being in that moment where this was happening, the same place and all this stuff. Now, it was a little odd because he was sort of like a little outside of himself. So he could sort of know that he himself was there in the foreground. But in the back, what was interesting was the more he went back, the more that, like, as it were, the depths were added to this event. where he started to see a figure standing in the background in the same room, in the corner of the room. Well, that figure he came to see eventually through these prayers and stuff was Christ. But that actually enraged him. And he says at one point he was having this prayer and he screamed at Christ, "Why don't you do something?" And he only got one response back, which is chilling, and it's very much what you just said. The voice said to him, "I do what you do." Which then would also imply I suffer what you suffer, right? Like I am in all of this on all sides, which is why all sides can eventually be reconciled through this very event, right? And so, and I just asked him after, I was like, so can you ever access a memory of that event that does not now include Christ? You know what I mean? Like, could you bracket him out? Like, has it been added? Like, is it just an addition you can sort of take out or remove as you will? And he basically was like, no. Like, I can't remember these things anymore without that dimension added. And to me, that was like, okay, this is what judgment is. Now, it's from a different angle than what you said, but it's the exact same idea.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you about the mechanics of hell. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
People have said that if universalism was considered true and taught, people would just leave the church or Christianity altogether. But what do you think? Is that true?
No. I always have just two or three responses that come immediately to mind. One is, if we're going to apply that logic to all eschatologies, tell me how Infernalism has done retaining its members of the church.
Yeah, how's that doing?
How's it going? So, like, I think usually that kind of, if it's really being weaponized, I think there's a way in which that question can be asked and it's genuine, like it's somebody who's just encountering this stuff for the first time. They really just don't know how to think. Okay, that's fine. I don't blame my students when they ask me that. But also,
I mean, and the disingenuous.
Exactly. Yeah. When you're raising it, you know how people use it cynically, right? And so my first thing there is just like, you don't want to play that game because you're going to lose.
Yeah,
you're going to lose on your very terms. So let's not play the consequentialist game, because in that case, hell is a pretty terrible instrument here, or buttress. So. But then I think the deeper thing is just like, I actually think people, and I think this does explain the intensity around the issue, people start to realize when you raise this possibility, or even you insist upon its logical, its logical coherence and its truth, they start to realize that their faith is not pure. They start to realize that they're motivated externally and by this system and power, a system of power and threats and fear. They realize that they've never taken 1 John seriously when it says perfect love casts out fear, because they're still totally driven and overridden by fear.
Yep.
Well, that's a problem, because if that's the case, then you don't have perfect love, and since God is love, it starts to throw a question about whether or not you know God. So that's my other thing, is like, no, look, actually, and this is where it kind of pivots, where I'm like, look, it's easier, and I don't even mean to always. Like, I'm not a straight evangelist type. I never have been. But my students are just inherently more attracted to the Christian faith. Now, they got all kinds of other hangups and stuff they're working through, or they don't want to right now. But they do, almost to a person. They'll say, like, if I could believe something like that, it automatically starts attracting them in a new way, or in a different way than it ever has before. And it's because then you're actually holding out as the only thing the gospel is that God alone will satisfy you in a way nothing else ever could. I mean, this is like an old idea. Mm-hmm. But it's like, okay, it's so old, it's so, so present and ubiquitous that in a way it's utterly absent from anyone's actual thinking. It's the thing you said earlier about like these very basic things. like Origen points he'll make, and it's just like, how do you not, and so I would say, I actually think it's fine if you're feeling frustrated at the Universalist because you're losing personally your motivation for faith. But I think you should interpret that as an opportunity to grow spiritually rather than as a flaw in the Universalism.
Right.
And then the last point I would just make is that if we really were going to go hard on that objection, you should see that that's not an objection to Universalism. It's an objection to grace. And that's also why you will find it addressed already by Paul in Romans, where he goes through all the grace stuff through Romans 3, there's no one righteous, no, not one. In Romans 4, he's got Abraham as the father of faith. Through faith, and grace, you're saved and you're incorporated all the way through Romans 11. But in that key moment, right, in the middle of Romans, so should we sin all the more that grace might abound? And then he says, by no means, because you've been liberated from sin. So the idea is to come to see not only is God alone what satisfies you, but sin is enslavement to ignorance. It's enslavement to things that won't satisfy you because they're false to their core. And so why would you ever want to go back to the thing that will simply continue to tyrannize you? So since you've been free, he says in Galatians, it's for freedom that you've been set free. That's what he says. For freedom, you've been set free in Christ. Freedom is God. God is the most free. And so, therefore, he's most satisfying for those who are free and want to be free and value freedom. So that's the life of the Spirit. That's Galatians 5. That's the fruit of the Spirit. Against such things, there is no law. Like, this is all that stuff. And so I think it's really useful. It's a good question in the sense that it reveals a lot. And so, I would say, if it really bothers you that you don't have the external threat of hell holding you to Christ, then maybe you should realize that perhaps you're not actually a Christian.
That's a good answer.
Just to put it diplomatically.
If we were to time travel to the future and attend a hypothetical Universalist Catholic liturgy, do you think you would find many formerly self-described atheists and unchurched people there who have returned to be part of a more like-minded spiritual community?
Yes, I do. And I think that because anecdotally, admittedly, but honestly, almost at a weekly basis at this point, or at least bi-weekly, like I get messages from people. I've experienced it in my own students. Like there are, of course, those students that we've just discussed that are at the stage, or those people that are at the stage where they're like unsettled and all this stuff, and they're thinking through, and they're like, well, why do I do this? Okay, so yeah, but I've honestly had much more. If I'm not debating people, or if we're coming at other Christians who are trying to like kind of attack this, if people are just listening in, or if they're just sort of being presented this, because there's so much weight, like hell's shadow is so heavy. It's so heavy that it casts itself on everything, even if you're infernalist and you're not trying to do that. Like I'm not a fire and brimstone type. Even if you kind of do, you really are in it because of Christ's love and God's goodness and beauty and for the truth. Like even if that really is personally what's holding you there and you don't have that problem of needing threats. The thing is, when you say it, and I see this in my own kids, like when my kids have been taught the difference between mortal sin and venial sin in their Catholic school, which they have, and then they're being prepped for First Communion, which they have, 2 of them. Like one of them in particular took it very hard. Like she's like, I'm so worried that I have mortal sin in my heart somewhere. And it became like a psychological weight. I think it's another example where it's like, this shadow is so heavy. You can't control it. And it casts itself on everything in the burden.
It's the most existential thing you can imagine.
There is literally, and by design, right? That's the whole point of the doctrine as it's typically represented, not as you have it with the mechanics of hell, which I think are far more interesting and actually more compelling and good. But the way the infernalist pictures it's normally presented, nothing can compete with the center of gravity that is presented there. Nothing. Not even God's grace.
Not even God, yeah.
Because God whichever version you choose, right? Either God doesn't actually does want that, so it's got right. God's own gravity behind it, or God can't really curb its effects in the end.
Yeah.
And so it's just as we're back to that absolute dualism, right? So I think that there's two reasons why I think I would find more atheists return. One is the just sort of feeling of like, wow, God is so much better, like so much more beautiful and more compelling than I thought. And there's a natural attraction to kind of beauty, good, truth, that people in the classical tradition and that love classical tradition stuff and who like hate modern secularism and materialism and rightly criticize a lot of it. Well, then you love art, right? You love Bach's cello suites like I do. Like you love great literature. And you get mad when we try to commodify it or reduce it to material value, right? Because the things that the things that are most important are transcendent, which means they precisely resist a simple practical use in order to be important. Like love, like your love for your kids or whatever. And you don't like it when an evolutionist, an evolutionary psychologist comes along and says, well, actually, the reason why you love your kids is because, evolution sort of built that into, all that
chemicals.
Stuff. Exactly. And it's like, yeah, okay. Basically, you erase the face of every kid and you literally just want a certain quantity in the next generation. No, that's not what love is like.
Yeah.
Okay. So you rightly resist all of that, infernalist Christian, when it comes to the secular atheist or whatever. But then you go around in your eschatology, you simply reproduce the same secular logic, which is, I need something more than God to make me and keep me interested in God. Absolutely not. I reject that wholesale. Okay. So anyway, that was a little bit of a rant to say, I do think people, once they see that, it will draw them in naturally because it's good, true, and beautiful, and so they'll be there. Point one. Point two is this though: even those that are like, and I have actually really good friends in this category. So I'm not even making it up. There are some people that I know that are atheists or agnostics. Some of them have a lot of baggage with Christianity. Some of them have no baggage. They just weren't raised religious at all. And what they say often, usually it comes in the form of like, if you had a church, I would go to your church. That's what they say to me. And I'm like, yeah, sorry.
I've had very similar experiences.
Yeah. And it's funny because it's like, yeah, I'm Catholic, so they won't let me be a priest. So, but because I'm married. But what they mean, right, is very clear. I think it's just like, hey, if that's really what Christianity was, if that's kind of what it was about, even if I'm not totally sure about everything, like what about the resurrection of Christ, all this stuff, I still would probably hang around.
Yeah.
And so you get that kind of interested seeker, whatever, if you want to make a biblical parallel, kind of God-fearer or whatever. And so they would be there, but the way I explained it is something I alluded to earlier, which is, and what's the other part of the attraction then isn't just that God and the gospel are more beautiful, which I think is true. But the additional thing is, because the weight has been lifted off, like you said, the most existential, the most grave existential threat imaginable, and therefore the most is always at stake in this sort of thing. If you relieve that with this pressure valve, then it actually allows the search.
Mm-hmm.
It actually encourages the search. It actually, every time I talk to my friend, he does not feel, one of my really close friends is also very much a disaffected Christian who's now an atheist and reads Yuval Noah Harari, and I'll make fun of him or whatever. But the thing is, we can have this wonderful relationship because he doesn't get the sense that I think his ultimate eternal, in the sense of perpetual misery, is on the line.
Right.
Because if you do believe that, and if you're just a person with a heart that's beating, you are going to try to do everything
Yeah.
To pull one over, to trick them, to employ strategies. You're always going to have the ulterior motive because there's nothing else that could command that sort of motivation, because it's the most grave thing. So
everyone, their humanity is reduced to a project.
Absolutely. That's actually a lot better way to say it than I was all the words I was using. Yeah, exactly. And so it's funny because it's a kind of weird Protestant. Luther made this argument once about grace and works, that if works were essential to getting to heaven, you could never love anyone without self-interest.
Yeah.
Because you doing a good work would always be something done for you, and the thing done for you is actually greater than whatever you just did for them. I think that's actually on its own, obviously I'm not a Lutheran, but that's a pretty good argument. I understand what he's saying there, and there's something true there. And what I would want to say is universalism of the type that I subscribe to and sort of would propose can actually account for that the true insight in that, and say, similarly, now I don't have to worry that I have failed you, because God has set up this honestly ridiculous labyrinth for us rats to run around, and he's given us not only no help and put all the burden on us to figure it all out, but he's actually allowed absolute obstacles and delusions of mirrors and smoke and mirrors to obscure the whole way out. And then he sits there, and then he says to himself, I hope it all works out. And then he gets real sad when it doesn't, or something, or not, And either way,
be the problem and sell the solution.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so think about this. All of that, if you have this perspective, is gone.
Yeah.
And so so I can relate to my friend, and he is not a project for me. In fact, it's allowed me to speak freer.
Right.
It even allows my critiques to be, in some ways, more blunt and more direct, exactly because he knows that the other side of that blade is not hell. You're going to hell.
Yeah.
And he knows all that about me, so we can have franker, fresher, better, open conversations. And so my point is, extend that out to a whole church scale. How could that not be a place where some people, no matter where they are, will be okay with being, and maybe even want to be?
Yeah. I've had so many of the same experiences. People will respect honesty. And I criticize my own tradition. I've done that so many times, not because I hate my own kind, but because you have to draw attention to problems before you can fix them. And also, when you're honest with yourself, people will respect when you're honest about them.
Yeah.
Because you're not some blind lover of Roman Catholicism. Because of that, you can criticize atheism. Because you're an honest person. You're not. It's not just blind faith.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people will always respect that, and that's been my experience. And so this fear of people leaving the church is just not founded in reality.
No, I think it's mostly just a projection of one's own anxiety over their own motives.
Yeah. And if you're just trying to proselytize people because of your own fear of going to hell, because this is something that God commanded you to do, and if you don't do it, you're in jeopardy, then that's kind of a selfish reason to be doing it, isn't it?
Exactly. Exactly. It's a very dark thing, because either outcome is there's again, hell's shadow just it's cast over it, right?
Yep.
Because either you're successful, but then you've sort of objectified them the whole time, you've reduced their dignity to a project accomplished. And we've all experienced that, right?
Yeah.
On one side or the other. I've done that to some people when I was younger. I've had that done to me, so I know what that's like. It's sort of dehumanizing. I mean,
For sure.
But then on the other, so even a successful version of that still does that project thing, that diminishment. But on the other hand, at the same time, this is what's so wicked about it. At the same time, if you fail in that project, you have already, as David Hart pointed out, right, you have already relinquished them to that misery and to it not affecting your own eternal bliss in the least. So either way you go, you diminish them to an incredible degree. All for what? For the sake of maintaining this version of this doctrine? For the sake of not ever admitting that like the church learns anything?
Yeah.
For the sake of what? So,
what's next for you? What projects are you working on, and what do you want to do in the future?
Oh boy, great question. It's really the one question you should never ask a supposed academic, because we love talking about all of our things, even if we never do them. Well, so the immediate things are, I'm almost done, and I've said this a million times and I've eaten my words, but literally, I think by the end of this month, June, I will have finished a draft of Maximus's letters finally. It's taken a while. There's been some detours.
Congrats.
Yeah. I still got to write the introduction and stuff, so I doubt there'll be a volume you can hold until next year, but I'm personally almost done with that one. A few other translation projects, but then there's a few books that I want to work on after that. There's a lot of like co-writing I'm going to be doing, which I think is fun. Two books with Roberto de la Noval. He's another Catholic thinker and universalist. We're actually going to do one on development of doctrine and like tradition and reading the magisterial texts. So that's a little bit more for Catholic side. And we're going to do one on Catholic universalism, which is going to be a lot bigger book, and that'll take longer. And then I don't know exactly. I've got all kinds of like ideas and books and stuff that I want to do. I eventually want to do one on like time, like deep time and evolutionary stuff with sort of this Origenian and Maximian sort of way to address that I think is unique. But yeah, I don't know. Some of those things.
Sounds great. We should do this again sometime. I'm sure there's a lot more we can talk about. I know we're both part of the same classified signal chat.
Yeah, exactly.
With a most curiously secretive Vatican journalist.
That's right. Oh, there's a lot we can talk about, and in that situation, I think I ought to be interviewing you. But yeah, nevertheless, we can get together and with our powers combined, kind of thing.
Well, Jordan, thanks for coming with me today, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this. And I know people watching this are going to be probably emailing you after this, thanking you for not thinking of them as a mere project. So until next time, we should do this again.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.